The lecture hall was silent, yet the tension was deafening. A black professor stood at the front, clutching his notes, as a voice from the back sliced through the air like a blade. "That seat isn't meant for people like you." The words, sharp and deliberate, echoed across the room, leaving behind a chilling weight that no one could ignore. For a moment, time froze. His eyes lowered, the insult pressing down heavier than the books he carried, heavier than years of qualifications, research, and sacrifice. In that instant, he wasn't a professor, a scholar, or a mentor. He was being reduced to the color of his skin. The students looked around, unsure, their faces twisted with disbelief and unease. Some lowered their gaze, afraid to intervene. Others clenched their fists beneath the desks, anger simmering just below the surface. But 20 of them, just 20, felt something deeper than discomfort. They felt a calling. It wasn't the first time prejudice had tried to silence him, but what happened next wasn't ordinary. These students, diverse in backgrounds yet united in spirit, chose not to let the venom of racism linger unanswered. Together they stood, not just for their professor, but for justice itself. This is not simply a story about one man's humiliation. It is about 20 young voices rising against hate, proving that sometimes the loudest statement comes from those who refuse to remain seated. He had always believed that education was a form of resistance. From the time he was a boy, growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and dreams were often suffocated by systemic walls, the idea of knowledge had become his shield. Books were not just paper and ink. They were his way of claiming space in a world that insisted he did not belong. His name was Professor Elijah Carter, a scholar of history whose voice carried the weight of generations silenced before him. To many of his students, he was more than just a lecturer. He was proof that brilliance could break through barriers. Yet behind his calm demeanor lay scars invisible to the eye. Each accolade, each publication, each academic honor came with the heavy price of enduring whispers in corridors, the doubting looks at faculty meetings, and the subtle exclusions masked as oversight. Still, Elijah carried himself with quiet dignity, never once allowing bitterness to consume him. The university itself was a blend of towering, ivy-covered walls and newly built glass structures. It prided itself on being progressive, yet beneath the glossy brochures and slogans of inclusivity, old prejudices simmered, sometimes hidden, sometimes blatant. For Elijah, the campus was both sanctuary and battlefield. Among his students were 20 young individuals who, unknowingly, would become the heartbeat of his defense. They were diverse in race, class, and background, each one drawn to his classroom not only for the subject matter, but for the rare authenticity he carried. He challenged them to think critically, not just about history, but about the present. He urged them to see patterns of injustice not as distant relics, but as living threads woven into daily life. In those early weeks of the semester, life unfolded in predictable rhythms. Mornings filled with lectures, afternoons with hushed study, sessions, evenings buzzing with campus chatter. Yet within the comfort of routine, shadows began to stretch. Small remarks in the staff lounge questioning his authority. A dismissive comment from a colleague that seemed harmless, but stung deeply. A student once hesitating before addressing him as Professor, as if the title felt misaligned with the skin he wore. Though he noticed, Elijah did not let it show. He poured his energy into his students, believing that if he equipped them with awareness, perhaps they would carry forward the change he had long fought to see. What he did not know was that soon, those very students would be tested in ways neither he nor they could have imagined. Professor Elijah Carter's presence lingered long after the final bell of class. Students often sat in silence once he left the room, their minds turning over the lessons he had just delivered. He had a way of weaving history into the present, of reminding them that injustice was not a chapter confined to yellowed pages, but a cycle that continued to repeat itself unless confronted. Yet for all the inspiration he provided, Elijah lived with the burden of constant scrutiny. In faculty meetings, his suggestions were overlooked until echoed by others. When committees formed, he was often excluded from leadership roles, his competence doubted in subtle, calculated ways. If a white colleague displayed firmness, it was praised as authority. If Elijah did the same, it was criticized as harshness. These were the invisible walls that caged his every move, though rarely acknowledged by those who had never felt their weight. The students who admired him most were the ones who saw through the veneer. Among them was Maya, a journalism major who carried her camera everywhere, capturing moments not just in frames, but in spirit. There was Daniel, a quiet engineering student whose father's words about sticking to your own kind had always troubled him, but who found a new sense of courage in Elijah's lectures. There was Aisha, the daughter of immigrants, who recognized in Elijah's calm defiance the same resilience her parents had carried when they crossed oceans for a better life. Each of these students carried private stories, but in Elijah's classroom they found common ground. He created a space where voices that often trembled with uncertainty grew stronger with every week. His lessons were not only about kings, revolutions, or the rise and fall of nations, but about patterns of power, about who was allowed to sit at the table of opportunity and who was pushed aside. Beyond the lecture halls, campus life hummed with energy. Students streamed across quads, cafes buzzed with chatter, and dormitories echoed with late-night laughter. On the surface, everything seemed unshakably normal. Yet beneath that normalcy lay the undercurrents of division, the quiet discomforts never spoken aloud. Flyers about inclusivity decorated bulletin boards, yet in certain fraternity houses, whispered jokes still reduced people of color to caricatures. The library displayed banners honoring diverse voices, yet only a handful of black faculty occupied its shelves of authorship. Elijah noticed these contradictions, but he bore them as he always had, silently, with the dignity of a man who had learned long ago that not every battle could be fought head-on. What mattered to him most was his classroom. It was his sanctuary, the one place where he felt the possibility of planting seeds of change. But the world had a way of intruding, even into sanctuaries. Subtle tensions began to ripple more openly. A faculty member joked at a luncheon that Elijah's rise to tenure had been helped along by diversity quotas. Laughter followed, the kind of laughter that cloaked malice in the guise of jest. A student once left an anonymous note on his desk that read simply, "Don't forget where you came from." He brushed these things aside in front of others, but the students who paid close attention began to notice the way his shoulders sometimes sank as he walked back to his office. They saw how, behind his poised lectures, his eyes occasionally drifted to a faraway place, as though carrying a weight no one else could see. The 20 students, those who had grown closest to him, were not yet fully aware of the storm they would soon face. But unknowingly, they were already being prepared. Elijah was not just teaching them history, he was teaching them how to recognize injustice, how to stand when silence seemed easier, and when the time came, that teaching would become their armor. Long. Before he became Professor Carter, Elijah had been just another boy in a neighborhood where dreams rarely stretched beyond survival. The streets he grew up on bore the marks of neglect, cracked sidewalks, shuttered storefronts, and schools where second-hand textbooks carried the names of generations who had passed through before him. Teachers told him to be realistic, as though aiming too high would only guarantee disappointment. But Elijah refused to shrink his vision. His mother, a nurse who worked double shifts, instilled in him the belief that his mind could carry him farther than his feet ever could.
She reminded him that the library was free, that knowledge was a gift no one could take away. Elijah would sit for hours in cramped corners of that library, devouring every book he could touch. History became his anchor. In the stories of revolutions,
freedom fighters, and thinkers who challenged the status quo, he saw reflections of his own struggle for legitimacy. Scholarships carried him through university, but they came with their own wounds. In lecture halls, he was often the only black student. Professors questioned his enrollment as though he had taken someone else's seat. He endured the loneliness, the whispers, the assumptions that his success was charity rather than earned. Over time, those experiences hardened his resolve. If he was told he did not belong, he would not just belong, he would excel. Now, as a professor, Elijah poured those lessons into his students. He did not tell them the full extent of his journey, but the conviction in his teaching betrayed it. He carried himself as someone who had survived storms, and in his presence, students felt both challenged and protected. Among the 20 who gravitated most fiercely toward him, a sense of unspoken kinship began to grow. They lingered after class, drawn not by obligation but by a hunger for meaning. Maya often asked if she could record his lectures for her projects, while Daniel quietly stayed behind, scribbling notes long after others had left. Aisha sometimes walked with Elijah across campus, carrying half of his books even when he insisted it wasn't necessary. It wasn't a formal group, at least not yet, but it was becoming one. They were young, restless, and eager to belong to something bigger than themselves. And in Elijah, they found a figure who mirrored their hopes. Life on campus carried on, deceptively calm. The football games still drew roaring crowds. The cafes still overflowed with laughter, and midterms still cast their shadow over restless nights. Yet for the students closest to Elijah, the world felt subtly altered. They began to notice what he had taught them to see, the cracks beneath the surface. They noticed how only a handful of black professors occupied an institution that celebrated diversity in its marketing materials. They noticed how students of color were often asked where they were really from, as if their presence required justification. It was not outright hostility, not yet. It was 1,000 little cuts, the kind of prejudice that hid behind smiles and handshakes. And though they could brush it off individually, the weight of it lingered collectively. Elijah had warned them in one of his earliest lectures. Injustice rarely arrives with a shout. Most often, it whispers first. The whispers were there now, curling in the corners of campus life. None of them knew how loud they would soon become. As the semester wore on, Elijah Carter's name began appearing more often in conversations, not always kindly. Some faculty members admired his innovative teaching methods, but others regarded him with a wary edge, as though his presence itself disturbed a fragile order. The whispers grew sharper, that he was too political, that his classes were more activism than academia. No one said it to his face, but the words carried in the air like smoke. The students noticed the shift. One afternoon, as Elijah presented a lecture on the Reconstruction era, a colleague slipped into the back of the lecture hall. The man's expression was unreadable, his pen scratching across a notebook as though auditing the class for flaws. The students exchanged uneasy glances. When the colleague left, Elijah continued teaching as if nothing had happened, but Maya's camera caught the faintest shadow crossing his face. Outside of class, subtle exclusions piled up. A departmental luncheon where Elijah's name was missing from the invitation list. A research grant where his proposal, though praised in reviews, mysteriously failed in the final round. Even the faculty lounge seemed to shift when he entered, conversations cooling, laughter fading. These were not accidents, they were signals, carefully delivered reminders that his seat at the table was conditional. But if the faculty tried to isolate him, his students did the opposite. The 20 began meeting more frequently outside of class, drawn together by their shared sense of unease. What started as study groups transformed into conversations about race, privilege, and power. They were young, but they were awakening, and Elijah's teachings gave them a language to name what they felt. Aisha's voice carried conviction when she spoke of her parents' sacrifices. Daniel admitted that he often struggled with his father's narrow views, torn between love and quiet rebellion. Maya, behind her camera, captured moments of the group's intensity, their furrowed brows, their clenched fists, their sparks of determination. Each student added their own layer of perspective, and together they wove a fabric of solidarity. Elijah noticed this change. He saw the way they lingered after class in groups rather than dispersing alone. He saw the passion flickering in their eyes, the way their questions dug deeper, no longer just about history, but about how history lived inside them. It gave him hope, though he carried it cautiously. He knew that hope, when tested, could fracture. The university still appeared polished from the outside, banners fluttering about progress and opportunity. Yet beneath that polished surface, fractures widened. The students felt it in passing comments, in the stares Elijah received in public spaces, in the way authority seemed quicker to question him than others. For now, they endured in silence. But their silence was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence before thunder, the charged air before a storm breaks. Each small injustice added to the weight pressing down, and though Elijah bore it with grace, his students began to feel it as their own. None of them could predict the moment when whispers would become shouts, but instinct told them it was coming. And when it arrived, they would have a choice, to shrink away or to rise. Each of the 20 students carried a private history, threads of experience that bound them more closely to Elijah's presence than they fully understood. They were not a single community at first, but fragments, different races, religions, and family backgrounds, yet each carried a scar that made them quietly receptive to his lessons. Maya's father had always told her that journalism was about finding truth, but truth was not always welcome. Growing up, she had witnessed how her mother, a nurse of mixed heritage, was treated differently from her white colleagues. When she walked into Elijah's class, she recognized something familiar in the way he bore himself with both strength and weariness. Her camera became her shield, capturing stories others wanted to erase. Daniel was different. Raised in a conservative home, he often found himself torn between his love for his family and his discomfort with the language they used about people who didn't look like them. At first, he entered Elijah's class simply because it fit his schedule. But something shifted in him as the lectures unfolded. He began to see not just history, but his own complicity in silence. Elijah's resilience unsettled him, forcing him to confront questions he had avoided all his life. Aisha's life was marked by sacrifice. Her parents had crossed borders, carrying nothing but determination to build a life in a foreign land. She had watched them endure insults from strangers who questioned their accents, their clothing, their right to exist in certain spaces. Sitting in Elijah's classroom felt like sitting inside her parents' unspoken stories. She admired the way he transformed pain into power, and she resolved to carry that strength forward. And then there was Jordan, a quiet student with a stutter, often overlooked in group settings. He found in Elijah's class a rare form of patience, a professor who never rushed him, never dismissed his halting words. For Jordan, this small dignity felt monumental. It was not about race for him directly, but about humanity, how dignity was either granted or denied in the smallest of interactions. Together, these students and 16 others were unknowingly forming a core, a small circle that would soon expand into something unbreakable. Though they did not yet call themselves a group, though no banner or manifesto declared their unity, something was being built between them, something stronger than friendship, deeper than routine. Elijah sensed it. He felt it in the way they lingered after lectures, the way their notebooks filled not just with facts, but with reflections. He felt it in the weight of their gazes when a colleague dismissed his ideas at a faculty event, and he caught them watching, jaws tight, eyes burning with quiet fury. It gave him both pride and fear. He knew the cost of defiance. He had paid it his whole life. He did not want these young people to bear it before they were ready. The days grew shorter, autumn shadows, stretching across the campus quads. Leaves scattered in bursts of red and gold, yet beneath the beauty of the season, unease deepened. It was in the murmurs Elijah heard in passing, the way certain students muttered under their breath when he passed. It was in the way the administration praised inclusivity in public statements, while in practice, their actions told another story. And then came the day when tension, long contained, finally bared its teeth. It happened suddenly, without warning, in the place where Elijah had always felt safest, his classroom. A voice rang out from the back, cold and cutting, declaring that he did not belong in the very seat he had earned. It was a moment meant to humiliate, to strip him of dignity before those he had dedicated his life to teaching. But what the aggressor did not anticipate was that Elijah was not standing alone. 20 hearts, 20 wills, 20 young voices were ready to rise. The storm had arrived, and the silence was about to shatter. The words hung in the air longer than the voice that had spoken them. That seat isn't meant for people like you. It was more than a sentence. It was an attempt to unravel a man's existence in a single strike. Elijah froze, his hand tightening around the chalk, the white dust smearing across his skin like ashes. For a breath, he said nothing. Silence spread through the lecture hall like a slow fire, consuming every corner of the room. The student who had spoken leaned back, in his chair, arms crossed, eyes sharp with defiance. His words were not clumsy or accidental. They were calculated, a direct attack not just on Elijah's authority, but on his very right to exist in that space. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared at their notebooks, unwilling to meet Elijah's gaze. But in the front rows, 20 pairs of eyes burned with something different. Fury. Maya felt her camera heavy in her bag, her instinct screaming to capture the moment, to freeze it in time so it could never be denied. Daniel's fists curled tight beneath the desk, nails digging into his palms. Aisha's breath came shallow, her chest rising and falling with barely contained rage. Jordan's stutter would have failed him if he tried to speak, but his body trembled with the force of words he could not yet voice. Elijah took a step back from the board. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice, when it came, was calm, measured. He continued the lecture, refusing to dignify the insult with acknowledgement. To him, this was survival. To the 20, it was a wound they could not ignore. After class, they gathered instinctively, their voices sharp with anger. Some wanted to report the student immediately. Others argued that the administration would do nothing. They remembered the stories Elijah had told them about silenced protests, about voices dismissed as exaggeration, about the long history of institutions protecting themselves over people. But still, they could not simply walk away. The insult had not just been directed at Elijah. It had been directed at everything he represented. If his presence could be questioned, then so could theirs. If his belonging was conditional, then theirs was too. In that moment, the 20 realized they were not just students anymore. They were witnesses to a battle, and whether they liked it or not, they were now participants. Word of the incident spread quickly across campus, carried by whispers, text messages, and social media posts. Some dismissed it as an overreaction. Just a comment, why make it a big deal? Others leaned into uglier narratives, maybe he doesn't belong. But there were also those who stood quietly with Elijah, unsettled by the cruelty of the moment, but too afraid to say so aloud. For Elijah, the incident was nothing new. He had endured worse in his life, words sharper than knives, rejections more painful than this one sentence. But the difference now was that he was not alone. For the first time, he saw in his students' eyes not just sympathy, but resolve. And, though he feared what that resolve might cost them, a part of him felt an unfamiliar flicker of hope. The days that followed did not ease the tension. The student who had spoken the words walked campus with smug indifference, emboldened by the attention. Anonymous notes appeared in Elijah's mailbox, some supportive, others filled with venom. His email flooded with messages, half demanding his removal, half praising his courage. The university administration issued a bland statement about valuing inclusivity. But behind closed doors, they urged Elijah to let it go, not to escalate matters. The 20 could not accept that. For them, this was no longer about one insult, but about a system that allowed such insults to thrive. They began meeting in secret, gathering in dorm rooms, libraries, and coffee shops. They spoke of strategies, of ways to make the university confront its hypocrisy. Maya proposed documenting everything. Daniel suggested a petition. Aisha spoke of organizing a public demonstration. What began as 20 voices soon grew louder, sharper, impossible to contain. They were no longer just students defending a professor. They were young people refusing to let silence erase injustice, and, as their determination grew, so too did the resistance against them. For every step they took forward, a new wall rose to block their path. The campus, once familiar and safe, was becoming a battlefield. The 20 students moved quickly from outrage to action. What had begun as hushed conversations in corners of the library soon grew into deliberate planning sessions. They knew the university would prefer the incident to fade into silence, swallowed by the endless churn of deadlines and campus distractions, but they refused to let it slip away. Maya was the first to act. She pulled her camera from its bag and uploaded a short, unedited clip she had secretly recorded during class. The moment the insult was hurled, Elijah's pause, the heavy silence that followed. Within hours, the video spread across social media, first among students, then far beyond. The caption she wrote beneath it was simple, but cutting. "This happened in our classroom today. This is what our professor endures." The reaction was immediate. Support poured in from alumni, activists, and strangers who recognized the pain etched into Elijah's stillness. Yet with support came vitriol. Anonymous accounts flooded the comments, defending the aggressor, mocking Elijah's composure, twisting the narrative to paint him as weak or overly sensitive. The video had cracked open the university's polished facade, and now the ugliness beneath was spilling out. Daniel drafted a petition demanding the university address the incident directly. Within days, hundreds of signatures appeared, but so did resistance. Flyers were torn down from bulletin boards. Counter-petitions surfaced, accusing the students of stifling free speech. Whispered insults followed them in hallways. Some professors subtly distanced themselves, warning the group not to jeopardize their future with unnecessary defiance. Aisha felt the weight most acutely. As an immigrant's daughter, she had been raised to keep her head down, to avoid confrontation in a country that could turn hostile without warning. Yet now, she felt fire in her veins. Every time she thought of her parents working tirelessly, to be accepted, she knew silence was no longer an option. She spoke passionately during meetings, urging the others not to let fear dictate their choices. Her voice steadied the group when doubt crept in. Elijah, meanwhile, carried himself with quiet restraint. He discouraged the students from putting themselves in danger, warning them that institutions had ways of crushing those who resisted too loudly. But even as he counseled caution, he felt an ache of pride. Their courage reminded him of marches he had studied, of movements where young people had reshaped the course of history. Still, he could not shake the fear that these students, his students, would bear scars meant for him. The campus climate shifted noticeably. Where once Elijah had been ignored, now he was the center of a storm. Some faculty offered quiet support, slipping notes of encouragement under his door. Others, however, avoided eye contact, their silence speaking volumes. A few openly criticized him for allowing the incident to escalate, as though his very existence was the provocation. For the 20, each day grew heavier. Their classmates began treating them differently, some with admiration, others with suspicion or outright hostility. In cafeterias, conversations paused when they walked by. In lectures, eyes followed them, some filled with respect, others with disdain. They were no longer invisible students. They were symbols of defiance. and symbols were easy targets. Late one evening, as the group gathered in a dimly lit dormitory lounge, the weight of it all pressed against them. Maya scrolled through hateful comments under her video, her hands trembling. Daniel admitted his father had seen the petition online and demanded he withdraw his name. Aisha confessed she had overheard classmates whispering that she was just stirring trouble because she wasn't really from here. For a moment, their resolve wavered. They were young after all, barely beginning to understand the cost of resistance. But then Jordan, usually the quietest, spoke. His words came haltingly, broken by the stutter he fought daily, yet their meaning was unshakable. He reminded them that Elijah had given them a voice, even when theirs faltered. If they abandoned him now, they would not only betray their professor, they would betray themselves. Silence followed his words, thick and heavy, before transforming into something stronger. Determination. The group leaned in closer, their faces lit by the dim glow of desk lamps. They made a vow, not spoken in unison, but understood in every heart, that they would not back down. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and they were ready to face it. The administration had long mastered the art of silence, but silence alone could not contain the wave of unrest that now rippled across campus. So they chose a different tactic: control. It began quietly. Emails appeared in the inboxes of the 20 students, politely reminding them of the university's policies on conduct, warning that disruptive activity could have consequences for their academic records. The wording was careful, polished, almost gentle, but the meaning was clear: stand down, or risk everything you've worked for. Maya received a notice from the student media board, questioning whether her video violated privacy policies. Daniel's scholarship committee sent him an unexpected review of his academic performance, though his grades had been impeccable. Aisha was suddenly informed that her visa status could be reconsidered if she engaged in activities deemed unlawful by campus authorities. These were not coincidences. They were calculated strikes designed to fracture their resolve. Elijah noticed the change immediately. Students who had once crowded his office hours now hesitated at his door. Some feared being associated with him. Others, though sympathetic, whispered that the risk was too great. He could not blame them. He had lived long enough to know how swiftly institutions punished defiance. But when he looked into the faces of the 20, he saw no fear, only fire. The awe. Pressure mounted on him as well. An anonymous complaint was filed, accusing him of bias in grading. Another claimed he was indoctrinating students with radical ideology. He was summoned to a faculty review panel, where polite smiles cloaked thinly veiled hostility. Questions were framed as concern. Do you feel your personal experiences cloud your teaching? Are you certain your classroom remains objective? He answered with steady precision, but each word felt like walking across glass. At night, Elijah sat alone in his office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His hands trembled as he sifted through anonymous emails, some filled with hate, others mocking his dignity. He thought of walking away, not out of weakness, but out of love for his students. If he left, maybe they would be safe. Maybe the storm would die with his absence. Yet another part of him knew the truth. Walking away would teach them that injustice wins when silence is chosen. The 20 refused to let him bear it alone. They intensified their meetings, now calling themselves a coalition. They printed leaflets, wrote articles, and organized teach-ins where students gathered to discuss the history of racism in education. They framed Elijah not just as a professor under attack, but as a symbol of a larger struggle. Their movement grew. What began as 20 voices swelled into hundreds, and the university responded with sharper teeth. Event permits were denied. Meeting spaces were locked. Flyers vanished as quickly as they were posted. Yet each attempt at suppression only fueled the students further. The more they were silenced, the louder they became. Still, beneath the determination, the strain showed. Maya's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. Daniel's voice grew harsher with each speech, and Aisha's hands shook whenever she confronted authority. Elijah saw the toll it was taking, and guilt gnawed at him. He wondered if he had unintentionally turned his classroom into a battlefield, if he had asked too much of the young souls who looked to him for guidance. But then he remembered Jordan's words in that dormitory lounge, words spoken haltingly, yet burning with truth. If we leave him, we leave ourselves. Those words echoed in Elijah's mind, steadying him. Perhaps this was the lesson he had been preparing them for all along, not through textbooks, but through living history. The campus could feel it too. The air itself seemed charged, each day heavier than the last. Tension spread like an invisible current through classrooms, cafeterias, dormitories. The university was no longer a sanctuary of learning. It was a contested ground, and every step, every word, carried the weight of confrontation. The storm was gathering momentum, and there would be no stopping it now. The first protest began quietly, almost humbly. A cluster of students gathered. On the central quad, their signs hand-painted, their voices uncertain at first. But what started as 20 soon swelled into a crowd. Some came out of solidarity, others out of curiosity, and still others simply because they sensed history unfolding before them. Maya's camera captured everything, the way Daniel stood with trembling hands yet spoke with a conviction that silenced the crowd, the way Aisha's voice carried across the open space like a bell, sharp and unyielding. Jordan stood near the front, his words halting but steady, as he reminded the gathering that dignity was not negotiable. Their message was simple, but powerful. Our professor belongs here, and we will not allow him to be erased. For Elijah, watching, from the edges of the crowd, the moment was surreal. He had dedicated his life to teaching the history of resistance, and now, before his eyes, his students were living it. A swell of pride rose within him, but so too did fear. He knew institutions did not forgive disruption easily. The backlash was swift. Flyers denouncing the coalition appeared overnight, accusing them of dividing the campus. Social media brimmed with hostility, mocking their cause, painting them as naive children playing revolution. A counter-protest emerged days later, with signs declaring "Keep politics out of education" and "All lives belong here." Their chants were louder, their numbers greater, and their message carried the weight of those who believed themselves to be defending order. The administration called the 20 into meetings, one by one, framing the encounters as concerned discussions. They were warned of potential consequences, told that their activism could jeopardize internships, graduate school opportunities, and even their safety. The threats were always couched in polite language, but their meaning was unmistakable. Despite this, the 20 pressed on. They organized sit-ins in academic buildings, filling hallways with bodies and silence, their stillness louder than any chant. They held candlelight vigils on the quad, hundreds of tiny flames flickering in the night, each one a silent promise that they would not back down. They wrote letters to local newspapers, exposing the hypocrisy of an institution that praised diversity in brochures, but punished those who demanded it in practice. But with every step forward, the cost grew heavier. Some of their classmates turned on them, calling them troublemakers, accusing them of making campus unsafe. Faculty who once nodded politely in hallways now looked away. Maya received anonymous messages threatening her if she continued filming. Daniel's father stopped speaking to him altogether, disgusted by his involvement. Aisha's mother begged her nightly to stop, terrified of what might happen if the wrong people noticed her daughter's face in the crowd. The coalition began to fracture under the strain. Arguments broke out in late-night meetings, tension rising over strategy, fear pressing in from all sides. Some wanted to push harder, to escalate until the administration had no choice but to act. Others feared that escalation would only destroy them. Their unity, once instinctive, now wavered under the weight of pressure, no group of young students should have to bear. Elijah watched all of it unfold with a heavy heart. He longed to protect them, to shield them from the cost of resistance. Yet he also knew that stepping in to stop them would be its own kind of betrayal. They had chosen this path, not for glory, not for attention, but for justice. And justice rarely came without scars. The quad, once just a patch of grass where students lounged between classes, had transformed into contested ground. Each day, as Elijah walked past, he could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, some supportive, others hostile, all watching to see what would happen next. The tension had reached its breaking point. The question was no longer if the storm would erupt, but when. The administration could no longer ignore the coalition. The protests had grown too visible, the petitions too numerous, the vigils too haunting to be dismissed as background noise. Pressure mounted from donors, alumni, and local media, each demanding to know why the university's name was now tangled in headlines about racism and unrest. So the administration chose to act, not with dialogue, but with force. It began with new restrictions. Flyers now required approval before posting. Demonstrations needed permits that were conveniently delayed, and gatherings larger than 10 were labeled safety concerns. Security officers began shadowing the students, their presence heavy, their eyes sharp. What was once an open campus began to feel like a monitored zone. The coalition refused to yield. They called for a mass demonstration, one that would not be hidden in quiet corners or diluted by polite wording. This time they would march through the heart of campus, signs raised high, voices unflinching. The day arrived under a slate-gray sky. Rain threatened but did not fall, the air thick with anticipation. Hundreds gathered, drawn by conviction, curiosity, or the pull of spectacle. At the center were the 20, their signs painted with truths too long denied. Our professor belongs here. Silence protects oppression. We will not be erased. As they marched, chants rose from the crowd, filling the campus with a rhythm of defiance. Maya's camera rolled steadily, capturing the surge of bodies, the passion in their faces, the energy that seemed unstoppable. Elijah walked behind them, torn between pride and dread. He knew this moment would not end quietly. They reached the steps of the administration building where security officers already waited. The crowd swelled against the barrier of uniforms, voices clashing with commands. Disperse immediately. This is an unauthorized gathering. But the students did not move. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady even as his hands trembled. He declared that they would not leave until their demands were heard, that Elijah Carter's dignity was non-negotiable, that the university's silence was complicity. Cheers erupted from the crowd, but so too did jeers from a smaller group gathered at the edges, holding countersigns. Stop playing victim. Keep politics out of classrooms. The clash was no longer just administrative. It was human against human, belief against belief. Tension snapped like a wire. A counter-protester shoved forward, his voice dripping venom, shouting that Elijah was nothing but a diversity hire. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by chaos. Students shouted back, security surged between bodies, and the air crackled with rage. Elijah felt his chest tighten as the moment spun out of control. He had seen this before, in photographs of marches long past, in history books that told of how quickly peaceful demonstrations could descend into violence. And now it was happening here, before his eyes, with his students at the center. Aisha found herself face to face with a security officer who barked at her to step back. She stood her ground, her voice ringing out above the noise. We are not afraid. We belong here. Her words drew cheers, but also fueled the anger of those who wanted her silenced. Jordan, shaking but resolute, pushed his way to the front. His stutter caught on his tongue, but he forced the words out anyway. You can't erase us. The crowd roared in support, his broken speech more powerful than any polished declaration. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Elijah stepped forward. His presence alone silenced the noise for a fleeting moment. His voice, calm but unyielding, cut through the air. This university claims to stand for truth. Then let it face the truth today. The words struck harder than any chant. For a heartbeat, even his opponents faltered. But the silence did not last. The administration refused to yield. The counter-protesters grew louder, and security closed ranks. The standoff stretched, unbearable, until it became clear. This was not the end of the fight, but only the beginning. The battle lines had been drawn, and no one on that campus would leave untouched. The protest had left the campus fractured, but what came next tore it wide open. The administration, under pressure from donors and alumni, announced an emergency decision. Elijah Carter was being placed under administrative review, barred from teaching until an investigation into his classroom conduct was complete. The announcement landed like a hammer blow. For Elijah, it was the culmination of every whisper, every slight, every carefully placed obstacle. His lectures, once the heartbeat of the 20s education, were replaced by silence. His office door was locked, his name scrubbed from the teaching schedule as though he had never been there. It was not just a professional suspension, it was an erasure. The 20 were devastated. Maya's eyes burned with fury as she read the notice pinned to the department's bulletin board. Daniel ripped the paper down with trembling hands. Aisha sank onto a bench, her body shaking with rage and disbelief. Jordan whispered the words aloud, stumbling over them, as if speaking them might make them less real. But they were real. Their professor, the man who had given them strength, had been silenced. The coalition acted swiftly. They organized an emergency assembly, filling the largest lecture hall they could claim. Students poured in until the aisles overflowed, voices buzzing with outrage. Maya stood at the front, camera perched on a tripod, recording every moment. Daniel delivered the opening words, his voice raw with anger. He declared that Elijah Carter had done nothing but teach truth, and for that, he had been punished. The crowd erupted in chants. "Bring him back! Justice for Carter!" The walls shook with the sound, but it wasn't enough. They knew. This battle had moved beyond slogans. It was now survival. Elijah sat alone in his small apartment that evening, the noise of the protests echoing faintly through his phone as videos spread online. He should have felt proud, but instead he felt hollow. He knew the risks better than anyone. He had studied the stories of others who had resisted. Professors blacklisted, careers destroyed, voices buried beneath the weight of institutional power. Was he about to become another name on that long list? Worse still, what would happen? To his students? He thought of Maya's defiance, Daniel's fury, Aisha's unshakable voice, Jordan's trembling courage. He thought of their faces, still so young, and wondered if he had led them into a fire they could not escape. The guilt gnawed at him, heavy as stone. The following day, the 20 made their boldest move yet. They staged a sit-in inside the administration building itself, occupying the marble-floored lobby with signs, chants, and an unshakable refusal to leave until Elijah was reinstated. Security encircled them, tension rising by the minute. University officials arrived with carefully rehearsed lines, urging them to disperse, warning of disciplinary action. But the 20 did not move. Hours passed. Crowds gathered outside, chanting, in support. Reporters arrived, cameras flashing, broadcasting the story far beyond the campus gates. The university, once in control of the narrative, was losing its grip. And then the breaking point arrived. A senior administrator, face taut with anger, stepped into the lobby and leveled his voice at the students. "You are jeopardizing your futures. This seat, this building, this institution is not meant for people like you. Leave or be removed." The words struck like lightning. They were the echo of the insult that had started it all, now spoken with the full authority of power. The crowd gasped. Maya's camera caught every syllable. Elijah, watching from the steps outside, felt his chest seize, as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. But the 20 did not break. One by one they rose to their feet, voices weaving together in a single declaration that shook the lobby. "We belong here!" The chant grew louder, rolling like thunder, drowning out the administrator's commands. Security moved forward, but the students locked arms, unyielding. Their voices surged higher, filling every corner of the building, echoing down hallways, spilling out into the streets. Elijah stepped inside. For a moment, all sound seemed to collapse into silence as he walked through the crowd, his presence a living contradiction to the lie just spoken. He climbed the marble steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood face to face with the man who had tried to erase him. His voice was quiet, but it carried more power than any shout. "This seat is mine, and so is theirs." The words hung in. The air undeniable, irreversible. The battle had reached its peak. There would be no turning back. The lobby had become a furnace of tension. The students' chant, "We belong here," rolled in waves, shaking the very walls. Security officers tightened their line, radios crackling with urgent orders, but the 20 refused to scatter. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms locked like chains, their faces pale with fear, yet burning with resolve. Maya's camera trembled in her hands as she recorded, but her lens did not falter. She knew this was no longer just campus history, it was history, full stop. Daniel's voice rang above the chant, raw and hoarse, demanding that the university end its sham investigation and reinstate Elijah immediately. Aisha, tears streaking her cheeks, raised her sign high. "Erasure is violence." Jordan, shaking so hard he could barely stand, forced himself into the front line, his stutter breaking as he shouted the chant with everything inside him. Outside, the crowd had grown into hundreds. Students from across campus gathered, some carrying candles, others wielding handmade banners. Reporters jostled for position, cameras raised, microphones extended. The university, once confident in its ability to contain the crisis, now found itself on display before the world. Inside, the senior administrator's face darkened. His words had already escaped, captured forever by Maya's lens, echoing online through live streams and social feeds. He tried to walk them back, insisting he had been misunderstood, but the damage was irreversible. The students only chanted louder. Security moved forward. The air thickened with dread. Students braced themselves as officers warned that those who refused to leave would be forcibly removed. For a heartbeat, fear flickered in their eyes. Futures hung in the balance, scholarships, visas, reputations, even safety. But then Elijah stepped forward, his presence steadying the chaos. He did not shout. He did not raise his fist. Instead, he spoke with a calmness that silenced even the officers. "If you remove them, you remove me too. If you silence them, you silence me. We stand together, or not at all." The words cut through the air like steel. For a moment, even the officers hesitated. Cameras zoomed closer, flashes ignited, and the image of Elijah standing among his students, tall, unflinching, unbroken, spread across the world in real time. News anchors scrambled to cover the breaking story. Social media exploded with clips and hashtags, "We belong here," "Wa Justice for Carter," "Students United." Politicians weighed in, some praising the courage of the coalition, others condemning them as reckless agitators. Alumni wrote open letters demanding accountability. The university's carefully polished image shattered under the glare of a national spotlight, but the 20 bore the brunt of the fallout. By evening, disciplinary notices were slid under their dorm doors, each one citing violations of campus conduct. Suspension loomed. Expulsion was threatened. Parents were called. Futures teetered on the edge of ruin. Still, none of them wavered. Instead, they gathered in Elijah's apartment, their voices hushed but steady. They sat on the worn furniture, exhaustion etched into their faces, yet their eyes still burned. Maya edited her footage into a short film, exposing the insult, the investigation, the silencing, the protest. She uploaded it with shaking hands. Within hours, it was everywhere. Elijah watched them in silence, his chest heavy with both pride and grief. He wanted to tell them to stop, to protect themselves, to let him bear the punishment alone. But he saw in their faces that it was too late for retreat. They were no longer simply his students. They were a movement, and movements did not back down, not when the world was finally watching. The morning after the sit-in, the campus awoke to silence that felt like the pause before thunder. Notices had been slipped under doors, taped to walls, and blasted through inboxes. They carried the university's crest at the top, bold letters beneath. Disciplinary action pending. Each of the 20 had been named. Suspensions loomed. Expulsions were on the table. Their alleged violations read like a list of crimes: inciting disruption, endangering public safety, violating university code of conduct. The words dripped with legal precision, but their true meaning was plain. You stood up, now sit down, or be erased. For Elijah, the blow was worse still. He received notice that the investigation into his bias and unprofessional conduct had escalated. He was no longer merely suspended. The board would soon decide whether to terminate him outright. His decades of scholarship, his years of teaching, his devotion to truth, reduced to a single question of whether he belonged. The students gathered in Maya's dorm room that night. The air was heavy, their faces pale. Daniel stared at the notice in his hands, his jaw clenched, so tightly it ached. Aisha wept quietly in the corner, her fear not only for herself but for her family, who had sacrificed everything to bring her here. Jordan sat trembling, unable to speak. The words lodged like stones in his throat. The room buzzed with arguments. Some urged caution. Perhaps if they apologized, if they backed down, the punishments would be softened. Others argued that retreat now would make every sacrifice meaningless. Their voices cracked under the weight of the decision before them: yield and survive, or resist and risk losing everything. Elijah listened in silence, his heart breaking. He saw the toll etched into their young faces, sleep-deprived, strained, frightened, and felt the crushing guilt of knowing he had dragged them into this fight. He wanted to beg them to stop, to walk away, to let him bear the punishment alone. But deep down, he knew it was no longer his choice to make. The following day, the coalition marched again, not with chants this time, but with silence. Hundreds joined them as they walked across campus in black clothing, their heads held high. They carried no signs, raised no fists. They simply walked to the administration building and stood. The sight was haunting. Reporters lined the sidewalks, cameras rolling. Faculty members watched from windows. Even those who had doubted felt the pull of the moment. The silence of the march spoke louder than any chant. We are not afraid. We will not be erased. When they reached the steps of the building, Elijah stepped forward. His voice was steady, though his chest ached with the weight of centuries pressing down. You may threaten their futures. You may strip me of my position. But you cannot erase the truth. And the truth is this: we belong. We always have. We always will. His words echoed through the crowd, carried beyond the campus by the cameras and microphones capturing every syllable. The silence broke into thunderous applause, a roar that drowned out even the security's commands to disperse. Inside the administration, faces blanched. The moment they had sought to suppress had now exploded beyond containment. It was no longer a campus issue. It was a national reckoning. But for Elijah and the 20, the consequences were not abstract. They knew the days ahead would decide everything: their careers, their education, their dignity. The university had drawn its line. The coalition had drawn theirs. The final confrontation was inevitable. And as night fell on the campus, no one knew who would still be standing when the storm passed. The lobby had become a furnace of tension. The students' chant, "We belong here!" rolled in waves, shaking the very walls. Security officers tightened their line, radios crackling with urgent orders, but the 20 refused to scatter. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms locked like chains, their faces pale with fear, yet burning with resolve. Maya's camera trembled in her hands as she recorded, but her lens did not falter. She knew this was no longer just campus history. It was history, full stop. Daniel's voice rang above the chant, raw and hoarse, demanding that the university end its sham investigation and reinstate Elijah immediately. Aisha, tears streaking her cheeks, raised her sign high. Erasure is violence. Jordan, shaking so hard he could barely stand, forced himself into the front line, his stutter breaking as he shouted the chant with everything inside him. Outside, the crowd had grown into hundreds. Students from across campus gathered, some carrying candles, others wielding handmade banners. Reporters jostled for position, cameras raised, microphones extended. The university, once confident in its ability to contain the crisis, now found itself on display before the world. Inside, the senior administrator's face darkened. His words had already escaped, captured forever by Maya's lens, echoing online through live streams and social feeds. He tried to walk them back, insisting he had been misunderstood, but the damage was irreversible. The students only chanted louder. Security moved forward. The air thickened with dread. Students braced themselves as officers warned that those who refused to leave would be forcibly removed. For a heartbeat, fear flickered in their eyes. Futures hung in the balance. Scholarships, visas, reputations, even safety. But then Elijah stepped forward, his presence steadying the chaos. He did not shout. He did not raise his fist. Instead, he spoke with a calmness that silenced even the officers. If you remove them, you remove me too. If you silence them, you silence me. We stand together, or not at all. The words cut through the air like steel. For a moment, even the officers hesitated. Cameras zoomed closer, flashes ignited, and the image of Elijah standing among his students, tall, unflinching, unbroken, spread across the world in real time. News anchors scrambled to cover the breaking story. Social media exploded with clips and hashtags. We belong here. Justice for Carter. Just Students United. Politicians weighed in, some praising the courage of the coalition, others condemning them as reckless agitators. Alumni wrote open letters demanding accountability. The university's carefully polished image shattered under the glare of a national spotlight. But the 20 bore the brunt of the fallout. By evening, disciplinary notices were slid under their dorm doors, each one citing violations of campus conduct. Suspension loomed, expulsion was threatened, parents were called, futures teetered on the edge of ruin. Still, none of them wavered. Instead, they gathered in Elijah's apartment, their voices hushed but steady. They sat on the worn furniture, exhaustion etched into their faces, yet their eyes still burned. Maya edited her footage into a short film, exposing the insult, the investigation, the silencing, the protest. She uploaded it with shaking hands. Within hours, it was everywhere. Elijah watched them in silence, his chest heavy with both pride and grief. He wanted to tell them to stop, to protect themselves, to let him bear the punishment alone. But he saw in their faces that it was too late for retreat. They were no longer simply his students. They were a movement, and movements did not back down, not when the world was finally watching. The morning after the sit-in, the campus awoke to silence that felt like the pause before thunder. Notices had been slipped under doors, taped to walls, and blasted through inboxes. They carried the university's crest at the top, bold letters beneath. Disciplinary action pending. Each of the 20 had been named. Suspensions loomed. Expulsions were on the table. Their alleged violations read like a list of crimes: inciting disruption, endangering public safety, violating university code of conduct. The words dripped with legal precision, but their true meaning was plain. You stood up, now sit down, or be erased. For Elijah, the blow was worse still. He received notice that the investigation into his bias and unprofessional conduct had escalated. He was no longer merely suspended. The board would soon decide whether to terminate him outright. His decades of scholarship, his years of teaching, his devotion to truth, reduced to a single question of whether he belonged. The students gathered in Maya's dorm room that night. The air was heavy, their faces pale. Daniel stared at the notice in his hands, his jaw clenched, so tightly it ached. Aisha wept quietly in the corner, her fear not only for herself, but for her family, who had sacrificed everything to bring her here. Jordan sat trembling, unable to speak, the words lodged like stones in his throat. The room buzzed with arguments. Some urged caution. Perhaps if they apologized, if they backed down, the punishments would be softened. Others argued that retreat now would make every sacrifice meaningless. Their voices cracked under the weight of the decision before them: yield and survive, or resist and risk losing everything. Elijah listened in silence, his heart breaking. He saw the toll etched into their young faces, sleep-deprived, strained, frightened, and felt the crushing guilt of knowing he had dragged them into this fight. He wanted to beg them to stop, to walk away, to let him bear the punishment alone. But deep down, he knew it was no longer his choice to make. The following day, the coalition marched again, not with chants this time, but with silence. Hundreds joined them as they walked across campus in black clothing, their heads held high. They carried no signs, raised no fists. They simply walked to the administration building and stood. The sight was haunting. Reporters lined the sidewalks, cameras rolling. Faculty members watched from windows. Even those who had doubted felt the pull of the moment. The silence of the march spoke louder than any chant. We are not afraid. We will not be erased. When they reached the steps of the building, Elijah stepped forward. His voice was steady, though his chest ached with the weight of centuries pressing down. You may threaten their futures. You may strip me of my position. But you cannot erase the truth. And the truth is this: we belong. We always have. We always will. His words echoed through the crowd, carried beyond the campus by the cameras and microphones capturing every syllable. The silence broke into thunderous applause, a roar that drowned out even the security's commands to disperse. Inside the administration, faces blanched. The moment they had sought to suppress had now exploded beyond containment. It was no longer a campus issue, it was a national reckoning, but for Elijah and the 20, the consequences were not abstract. They knew the days ahead would decide everything: their careers, their education, their dignity. The university had drawn its line. The coalition had drawn theirs. The final confrontation was inevitable. And as night fell on the campus, no one knew who would still be standing when the storm passed. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, in a hall that normally hosted academic conferences and donor banquets. That day, it became a stage for reckoning. The university board sat elevated at the front of the room, their suits pressed, their expressions unreadable. A long mahogany table stretched between them and the rows of chairs reserved for faculty, students, and press. The air was cold, the silence brittle. Every creak of a chair, every shuffle of paper sounded amplified. Elijah sat alone at a small table before the board, the lone figure accused of fostering division and violating standards of conduct. His hands rested flat against the polished wood, though he could feel them tremble beneath the surface. Behind him sat the 20, their presence a shield. They had vowed to stand with him no matter what. And here they were, eyes fierce, backs straight, their futures hanging by a thread. The proceedings began with clinical precision. A university lawyer listed the charges in a voice drained of emotion. They spoke of unauthorized protests, disruption to academic life, and allegations of indoctrination. Each word was a knife, dressed in professional language, aimed to sever Elijah from his position. Elijah listened, his face calm, but inside he felt the weight of every word pressing him down. He thought of all the lectures he had given, the essays he had graded late into the night, the countless hours spent nurturing minds that now sat watching, helpless, as his career was put on trial. When the lawyer finished, the chair of the board invited Elijah to respond. For a long moment he remained silent, gathering the storm inside him. Then slowly he rose. His voice, when it came, was steady, deep, and filled with a restrained fire. You accuse me of dividing this campus. Yet it was not I who told a student that this seat was not meant for people like her. It was not I who turned silence into policy, who tried to erase the dignity of those who dared to question injustice. I did what every educator is called to do. I told the truth. If truth divides, then perhaps it is not the truth that is at fault, but those who fear it. A ripple moved through the room. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. Cameras clicked. The 20 sat taller. Then one by one, the students rose. Maya stepped forward first, her voice ringing clear. She described the moment she filmed the administrator's words, the rage she felt, and the certainty that silence would have made her complicit. Daniel followed, recounting the disciplinary notice that threatened his scholarship, but insisting he would not regret standing beside his professor. Aisha spoke of her family's fear, of the late-night calls begging her to stop, and of her decision to stay anyway. Jordan, trembling, forced out each syllable, declaring through his stutter that Elijah had given him the courage to believe in his own voice. Their testimonies were not rehearsed. They were raw, imperfect, human, and they pierced deeper than any polished defense. By the time the last student finished, the room felt transformed. The board members looked shaken, not because they had lost their authority, but because the truth had stripped it bare. The decision still lay in their hands, but the world was watching. The story had already spread beyond the walls, beyond the campus, into living rooms and headlines across the nation. The chair of the board cleared his throat, his voice faltering ever so slightly as he announced that the decision would be deliberated in private. The room erupted in whispers, reporters scrambling to push their stories, students clutching each other's hands in dread. Elijah remained standing, his students gathered around him. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the future hanging in a fragile balance, the weight of generations pressing down. This was the edge. Whatever came next would change everything. The board filed out of the chamber in silence, their polished shoes clicking against marble floors. The heavy doors shut behind them, leaving Elijah and the 20 in a hollow room buzzing with whispers and the clicking of reporters' keyboards. The wait began. Minutes stretched into hours, each one more suffocating than the last. Elijah sat, rigid at the table, staring at the grain of the wood, tracing its ridges with his eyes. He thought of his father, a man who had once been told in his youth that college wasn't for people like him. He thought of his mother, who had worked double shifts so he could sit in classrooms that had once been barred to her. He thought of every lecture he had given about resistance, every story of those who refused to bow, and wondered if he would soon join them, remembered not as a professor, but as a casualty. The students huddled together in the back rows, their silence louder than any chant. Maya's camera sat on her lap, unused for the first time. Her hands trembled too badly to hold. It steady. Daniel paced the aisle until his legs ached, muttering under his breath, rehearsing arguments he would never get to deliver. Aisha clutched her necklace so tightly it cut into her palm, whispering prayers in the language of her childhood. Jordan sat frozen, his lips moving silently, as though repeating the same words over and over, a mantra to keep himself from breaking. Outside, the campus boiled. Crowds had gathered on the quad, their chants rising like thunder. "We belong here! Justice for Carter!" The sound seeped through the windows, a living heartbeat that refused to die. Police stood at the edges, tense and watchful. News crews swarmed, their cameras capturing every flicker of unrest. The university had wanted to keep this quiet, hidden behind bureaucratic doors, but now it had become a national spectacle. Finally, the doors opened. The board returned, their faces pale, their eyes shadowed by the weight of a decision that would define the institution for years. The chair cleared his throat, the microphone crackling. The room fell silent. Elijah's heart pounded. The 20 leaned forward, breaths held. After careful deliberation, the chair began, his voice straining for authority. "This board has determined that Professor Elijah Carter did not violate university policy. The charges are dismissed. He will be reinstated." The words hit like a shockwave. Gasps filled the room, followed by cheers that erupted from the students, echoing off the walls. Maya's tears streamed unchecked as she clutched Daniel's arm. Aisha fell to her knees, in relief, whispering thanks into her trembling hands. Jordan sobbed openly, his stutter breaking into cries of joy that filled the chamber. Elijah closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he let the weight slip from his shoulders. He did not smile, not yet. He knew this was not victory, not entirely. The scars of the battle would remain, the threats, the notices, the sleepless nights, the quiet betrayals. They could not be erased by one declaration. But in that moment, standing before his students, he knew the truth. They had not been broken. The chair tried to quiet the room, announcing that disciplinary actions against the protesting students would still be considered. But by then, the tide had turned. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. The world had already claimed its headline, "Students Save Black Professor from Erasure." As Elijah turned to face his students, he saw their faces glowing with pride, exhaustion, and something greater, resolve. They had stood against an institution that tried to silence them, and they had forced it to listen. For the first time in weeks, Elijah smiled. It was small, weary, but real. He looked at them and thought, this is what freedom feels like, not given, but taken, held with trembling hands, and guarded fiercely against the dark. The climax had passed, the storm had broken, but the impact was only beginning. The decision spread across campus like wildfire. By evening, the quad was alive with celebration, cheers echoing against stone buildings, candles flickering in windows, drums and clapping rising into the night. For many, it felt like a moment of triumph. The university had been forced to back down. Elijah Carter had been reinstated, and the 20 had proved that voices, when united, could not be silenced. But victory came with shadows. The 20 returned, to their daily lives carrying scars that no headline could erase. Maya found her inbox flooded with hate mail, anonymous messages calling her a liar, accusing her of fabricating the video that had exposed the administrator. She deleted them, but some nights, their venom clung to her mind, keeping her awake. Long after the celebrations had ended, Daniel's scholarship committee quietly reviewed his funding. Though he retained it, the warning was clear. One wrong step, and it would be gone. His father still refused to speak to him, their silence a canyon that stretched wider with each passing day. Aisha's mother, still fearful for her daughters. Safety begged her to keep her head down to avoid further conflict. Yet Aisha could not. She walked across campus with her chin higher than before, unafraid of the whispers. Still, the anxiety lingered, heavy in her chest whenever she passed. The administration building. Jordan was celebrated by his peers for his bravery, yet he struggled to accept it. Every time someone praised his words, he remembered the trembling in his body, the way his voice cracked, the fear that had almost silenced him. He did not feel heroic. He felt human, fragile, and exposed. And Elijah, though reinstated, was changed too. His lectures resumed, but the classroom was no longer the same. Some students avoided him, wary of the controversy. Colleagues offered smiles in public but kept their distance in private. His office filled with flowers and letters from across the country, yet he often sat at his desk late into the night, staring at them, wondering why it had taken such suffering for his humanity to be recognized. Yet, amid the exhaustion and grief, there was also something unshakable. The 20 had grown closer, bound by fire. They studied together, ate together, supported each other when the backlash grew too sharp. They had walked into the storm as students and emerged as something more, a community, a family forged in defiance. Nationally, the story reverberated. News anchors debated the case, activists praised the students, and universities across the country faced questions about their own silent prejudices. Elijah Carter became a symbol, though he never asked to be one. He remained what he had always been, a teacher. But now, his lessons had escaped the walls of the classroom and entered the world. One evening, weeks later, the 20 gathered again, this time not in protest, but in quiet reflection. They sat in Elijah's apartment, the same place where fear had once weighed them down. Now, the room was lighter. They laughed softly, shared stories of the days that had nearly broken them, and allowed themselves at last to feel relief. Elijah looked around the room, his heart swelling. These were no longer just students. They were witnesses, survivors, leaders. They had carried him when he thought he could not go on, and in doing so, they had changed the course of their own lives. As the night drew to a close, Elijah spoke. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had endured. What you did here will outlive all of us. Never forget, truth is costly, but silence costs more. You stood when others wanted you silent, and because of that, you've written a story this university can never erase. The room fell quiet. The 20 exchanged glances, their faces marked with the memory of pain, but also with the glow of pride. Outside, the campus slept, unaware of how much had shifted. But inside that small apartment, history had already been written. Time passed, but the echoes of that semester never faded. The story of Elijah Carter and the 20 became woven into the fabric of the university. Some celebrated it as a victory for justice. Others whispered it as a cautionary tale. But for those who lived it, the memory was a compass that guided every step afterward. Elijah continued to teach, though never quite the same way. His lectures carried a new depth, his voice laced with the gravity of lived experience. He no longer spoke of civil rights as distant history. He spoke of them as something his students had embodied in their own lifetimes. When new students entered his classroom, they didn't just learn from a professor. They learned from a survivor, from a man who had been pushed to the edge and pulled back by the courage of 20 young souls. The 20 scattered in the years that followed, each carrying the fire in their own way. Maya became a filmmaker, her camera forever pointed at stories others tried to erase. The viral video she had edited during the sit-in became the seed of a career dedicated to truth-telling, exposing injustices in places far beyond the campus gates. Daniel pursued law, his fury sharpened into focus. He carried with him the memory of standing on those marble steps, defying the voice that told him he did not belong. In courtrooms, he fought for those silenced by systems far larger than a university. Aisha entered politics, determined to create policies that protected voices like hers from being crushed. She never forgot the fear in her mother's voice, nor the strength it took to stand anyway. Each speech she gave, each campaign she ran, was an echo of that defiance. Jordan found his calling as a teacher He told his students that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of speaking while trembling. He told them his own story, not of perfection, but of persistence, and in doing so, gave them the freedom to believe their voices mattered, even when cracked or broken. Others among the 20 became writers, organizers, educators, healers. Their paths diverged, but the fire they had carried together burned in each of them. They were never the same again, because once you've stood at the edge of erasure and declared, "We belong," you carry that truth with you forever. For Elijah, the greatest legacy was not the reinstatement, nor the headlines, nor even the symbolic weight history placed upon his shoulders. It was the knowledge that he had taught, not just in lecture halls, but in the living moment of struggle. He had seen his students take his lessons beyond the classroom and shape them into action. Years later, when he walked across the campus as an older man, he sometimes paused by the administration building. The stone walls stood the same, but to him they hummed with memory, the chants, the silence, the unshakable voices of 20 students. He would smile quietly, knowing the story would not fade, because injustice never sleeps, but neither does truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be unheard. Elijah often asked himself one question as he lectured to new generations. What will they do when their moment comes? And though he never said it aloud, he already knew the answer. Because of the 20, he believed it. In the end, the question was never whether Elijah Carter and his students belonged. The real question is this: when hatred tells you that will you stay silent or will you rise and fight back?